Berlin, 30 April 1945, shortly after 3 in the afternoon. Above ground, the city is dying. Soviet shells fall on the Tiergarten in clusters of 4 and 5, and the air carries the particular smell of a capital on fire, brick dust and cordite and something sweeter underneath that nobody names aloud. Below ground, 8.5 meters beneath the ruined garden of the old Reich Chancellery, a narrow corridor lit by bare bulbs runs quiet. A door closes. Behind it, a man who 3 years earlier commanded an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Moscow sits down in a small concrete-walled study with a woman he married the previous night. A single shot rings out through the low ceiling. Nobody in the corridor moves for several minutes because they have been told to wait. When the door finally opens, the Third Reich, in every meaningful sense, has already ended. This is the story of that room and of the strange, cramped, unglamorous fortress that swallowed it. Not a weapon, not a battlefield, but a hole in the ground that became the last address of one of the most destructive regimes in human history. Understanding the Führerbunker means understanding how a movement that built its image on marble, eagles, and endless parade grounds ended its life in 30 low-ceilinged rooms with damp concrete walls, a diesel generator, and air that never quite lost the smell of the men and women trapped inside it. The bunker did not cause the end of Nazi Germany, but it is where that end became physical, undeniable, and, for the man at its center, final. For most of the war, Adolf Hitler had little use for a Berlin bunker at all. He preferred his forward headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in the forests of East Prussia, where he could direct the war against the Soviet Union from relative comfort, or the mountain retreat above Berchtesgaden, where the view did nothing to suggest a continent was burning. Berlin itself, the capital he intended to rebuild as Germania, a city of triumphal arches and a dome larger than St. Peter's, was for propaganda and ceremony rather than residence. That calculation changed as the war turned against Germany. British and American bombers, having spent 1940 absorbing the Blitz, began returning the favor with interest, and by 1943, Berlin was suffering the kind of sustained aerial punishment that made even the regime's inner sanctum feel unsafe. The existing shelter beneath the Chancellery, a modest structure completed in 1936 and later known as the Vorbunker, had been adequate for air raids lasting an hour or two. It was not built to survive a siege, and by the autumn of 1943 it was clear that Berlin might face exactly that. Soviet forces had shattered the German position at Stalingrad in February of that year, ending any realistic hope of victory in the east, and the strategic picture only worsened from there. RAF Bomber Command, joined increasingly by American forces flying daylight raids, subjected Berlin to a sustained campaign that would eventually reduce much of the government quarter to scorched facades and rubble-choked streets. A regime that had once broadcast newsreels of its own bombers over London now found its own capital absorbing the same treatment it had dealt out, an irony rarely acknowledged in the bunker's briefing room, but impossible to miss in the wreckage above it. A new, deeper, better protected shelter was needed, not as a temporary refuge from bombing raids, but as a command post capable of running a government and directing a collapsing military machine for months on end, regardless of what was happening on the streets above. The men responsible for the Reich's construction projects were given a brief that read, less like an architectural commission and more like an admission of defeat nobody was permitted to state openly. Build somewhere the war can be lost in relative safety. Existing shelters across the city, however heavily reinforced, had proven vulnerable to the newest generation of Allied bombs, designed specifically to punch through conventional shelter roofs before detonating. Whatever was built beneath the Chancellery would need to withstand exactly that threat indefinitely, while housing not merely a handful of sheltering civilians, but the entire apparatus of a wartime government. The task fell to Albert Speer's ministry and the architect Karl Piepenburg, working through the construction firm Hoch Tief, the same organization responsible for much of Germany's wartime fortification program. Ground was broken in 1943, and the new structure, positioned some 2.5 meters below the existing Vor bunker and slightly to its west, was completed the following year at a cost of roughly 1.25 million Reichsmarks, a modest sum by the standards of a regime that had poured billions into failed offensives, but a striking one for 30 rooms buried under a garden. The roof alone consumed almost 3 meters of reinforced concrete, with certain sections thickened to closer to 4, a mass roughly equivalent to stacking a small block of flats on its side and burying it, engineered to withstand a direct hit from the heaviest ordnance the Allies were likely to drop. Inside, the Führer bunker was less a headquarters than a warren. Corridors barely wide enough for 2 people to pass ran between small rooms fitted out with whatever furniture and artwork could be salvaged from the Chancellery above. Oil paintings hung in spaces with all the atmosphere of a submarine. There was a conference room where the daily military situation briefings took place, a telephone switchboard connecting the bunker to what remained of German command structures nationwide, private quarters for Hitler and, later, for Eva Braun, and cramped dormitory space for secretaries, adjutants, and, eventually, the 6 children of Joseph and Magda Goebbels. Diesel generators supplied electricity, a separate system pumped water, and a crude ventilation network tried, not always successfully, to keep 30 confined rooms breathable for the several dozen people who would eventually be living in them. A steel bulkhead door separated the Führer bunker from the older Vor bunker above, allowing either level to be sealed off from the other, an architectural detail that says more about the atmosphere of paranoia in that final year than any speech could. The doors themselves deserve a moment's attention. Reinforced and designed to be gas-proof, they were heavy enough that closing one produced a dull, resonant thud closer to a bank vault than a household door, and the gap between the Führer bunker and Vor bunker levels was sealed with airlocks intended to protect against chemical attack, a threat the regime's own propaganda had spent years insisting it need never fear. Ventilation shafts ran up through the rubble to grilles disguised among the Chancellery garden's shattered flower beds, drawing air down into rooms that, by every surviving account, never entirely lost a damp, faintly metallic smell, the inevitable result of pumping fresh air through meters of concrete still curing from a construction project finished in wartime haste. Communication with the outside world depended on a telephone exchange and, increasingly unreliably as Soviet forces closed in on the city's transmission masts, radio links to military headquarters that were themselves retreating or already overrun. By the final week of April, staff inside the bunker sometimes knew less about the fighting a few streets away than intelligence officers hundreds of kilometers distant. An extraordinary state of affairs for the supposed nerve center of a national government. It is worth pausing on the sheer scale mismatch between the man and his shelter. Here was the head of state of a regime that had commissioned a planned Great Hall in Berlin, intended to hold over 100,000 people beneath a dome 16 times the volume of St. Peter's Basilica. That regime's actual seat of government, by the spring of 1945, was a room you could cross in 4 strides, with a camp bed, a writing desk, and walls that wept condensation. The contrast between Nazi architectural fantasy and Nazi architectural reality has rarely been more complete or more literal. Hitler took up more or less permanent residence in the Führer bunker from January 16, 1945, arriving from what remained of the Eastern Front as the Red Army pushed deeper into German territory by the week. From that point, the bunker functioned as the effective seat of the collapsing Reich government, hosting the situation conferences at which Hitler, working from maps and reports increasingly detached from the reality above ground, issued orders to divisions that, in some cases, no longer existed. Survivors of these final weeks describe a peculiar claustrophobic rhythm, meetings running late into the night, artificial light standing in for any sense of day or season, and a growing gap between the confidence projected in the briefing room and the sound of Soviet artillery, audible through the concrete by early April, growing closer by the day. Secretaries who survived the war and were later interviewed by historians and by British intelligence officers trying to reconstruct these final weeks describe a strange domesticity persisting alongside the collapse. Tea served on schedule. Hitler's fondness for his Alsatian, Blondie, undimmed even as the military situation became hopeless. Birthday pleasantries exchanged in a room that everyone privately understood to be a tomb in waiting. Reports from those present suggest that towards the very end, uncertain whether the cyanide capsules supplied by the SS were genuine or had been tampered with, Hitler ordered a dose tested on Blondie, a detail that, whatever its precise accuracy, has become one of the bunker's most frequently repeated and most chilling footnotes. On April 20th, his 56th birthday, Hitler briefly emerged into the ruined Chancellery garden to decorate a line of teenage Hitler Youth conscripts sent to defend a capital that had, by any military logic, already fallen. It was among the last times he was seen in daylight. 2 days later, Joseph and Magda Goebbels moved into the bunker with their 6 children, having decided that the family would not survive the fall of Berlin, nor did they intend to try. By late April, with Soviet troops fighting street by street barely a few hundred meters from the Chancellery, the bunker's population included secretaries, military aides, SS guards, and a shrinking circle of true believers who had chosen to stay rather than attempt an escape through Soviet lines that most reasoned, correctly, would not succeed. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there's more of this story still to come. Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony inside the bunker just after midnight on April 29th, and spent the following day dictating his personal will and political testament, documents that blamed everyone but himself for the catastrophe unfolding above his head. At around 3:30 on the afternoon of April 30th, he and Braun withdrew into his private study. Within minutes, those waiting outside heard a single gunshot. After an interval reportedly ordered by Hitler himself, aides entered to find Braun dead from cyanide and Hitler dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Following his instructions, the bodies were carried up into the Chancellery garden, doused in petrol, and burned in a hurried, incomplete cremation, made more difficult by the ongoing Soviet artillery fire that persuaded the small group of witnesses not to linger over the task. The following day, Magda Goebbels poisoned her 6 children, and she and her husband then took their own lives in the garden above. Others attempted to break out through Soviet lines that night. Some succeeded, most did not, and Martin Bormann, once among the most powerful men in the Reich, died somewhere in the attempt, his fate uncertain for decades afterwards. It is worth comparing the Führer bunker with the other command posts Hitler used during the war, because the contrast tells its own story. The Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, in operation from 1941, was a sprawling forest complex of bunkers, barracks, and airstrips, built for a war Hitler still expected to win, its scale reflecting a confidence the Führer bunker never pretended to. The Werewolf headquarters near Vinnytsia in occupied Ukraine, completed in 1942, served a similar purpose on the southern front, another expression of a regime still planning offensives rather than merely delaying its own collapse. The Berlin bunker, by contrast, was built explicitly as a last resort, a structure for surviving a siege rather than directing a campaign, and it shows, cramped, hastily furnished, designed around endurance rather than command. Set it beside the Allied equivalent in London, the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, and the difference in purpose becomes clearer still. Churchill's underground headquarters, in use from 1939, was built to keep an elected government functioning through sustained bombing, while that government retained every intention and every practical means of winning the war outright. It, too, was cramped and improvised in places, but it operated in the open. Its existence never a state secret, its purpose never in doubt to the public it served. The Führer bunker, by its final weeks, was keeping something rather different alive. Not a war effort with any remaining prospect of success, but the personal authority of one man and the small circle unwilling to admit that authority had already become meaningless. Even its location remained officially unacknowledged to the German public throughout, consistent with a regime that had spent 12 years insisting on strength and now found itself hiding, quite literally, underground. Two underground shelters, built for broadly similar physical threats, ended up serving almost opposite functions. One sustaining a democracy's fight to survive, the other prolonging a dictatorship's refusal to accept it had already lost. It is also worth noting how little the Führer bunker resembled the wider German fortification effort of the same period. The Atlantic Wall, stretching thousands of kilometers along the coastlines of occupied Europe, and the vast network of flak towers built to defend German cities from the air, represented an entirely different scale of engineering ambition. State resources poured into structures meant to project strength outward. The bunker beneath the Chancellery garden was the inward-facing mirror image of that same instinct. Not a wall built to keep an enemy out of a continent, but a hole dug to keep one man safe from the consequences of having tried. The physical bunker did not long outlast the man who died in it. Soviet forces, who took the Chancellery grounds in the first days of May 1945, made initial attempts to destroy the complex in 1947, though the sheer thickness of its concrete made full demolition slow and only partly successful. Sections survived, largely forgotten, sealed beneath the no-man's land that ran along the Berlin Wall for over 4 decades, an odd historical footnote entombed within the most heavily fortified border in Europe. It was only after German reunification, during redevelopment of the area in the late 1980s and early 1990s, that most of the remaining structure was finally cleared away. What followed was a deliberate act of civic forgetting. The Federal Republic had no interest in creating a shrine, and for decades the exact location of Hitler's death carried no marker of any kind. Just flats, a car park, and pedestrians who in most cases had no idea what lay beneath their feet. Only in 2006, 61 years after the events it commemorates, did the German government permit a small information panel, showing a schematic of the bunker's layout and a brief, factual account of its history, understated almost to the point of invisibility, and quite deliberately so. Rumors persist that further sealed sections remain intact somewhere beneath modern Berlin, unverified and probably unverifiable, the kind of story that outlives any of the physical evidence available to test it. The bunker's afterlife has been almost entirely cultural rather than physical. In the months after the war, Soviet authorities briefly and falsely suggested Hitler might have survived and fled, a claim that triggered a wave of supposed sightings across Europe and left Western Allied officials with a genuine intelligence problem, proving a death with no accessible body and only a hastily cremated set of remains to go on. British military intelligence tasked the historian Hugh Trevor Roper with interrogating surviving bunker staff and assembling, from their testimony, the first authoritative account of what had actually happened underground in those final days. His conclusions, published shortly after the war, have been refined rather than overturned by later research, including forensic work on surviving dental remains that has, over the decades, only reinforced the consensus that Hitler died in the bunker on April 30, 1945, whatever conspiratorial alternatives have circulated since. The bunker survives now chiefly through those memoirs and interrogation transcripts, and, more recently, through films that have tried to recreate its final airless days for audiences who will never see the real thing, since there is, quite literally, nothing left to see. That absence is itself the point. A regime built on monumental scale, on domes and boulevards designed to awe, left behind for its own final headquarters no monument at all, a parking space, a plaque the size of a paving stone, and a silence Berlin has chosen, deliberately and for good reason, never to fill. Return for a moment to that corridor on the afternoon of April 30th, 1945. The bare bulbs, the closed door, the small group of aides waiting the interval they had been told to wait. 3 years earlier, the man behind that door had stood over maps of a continent under his control, planning boulevards and domes for a capital meant to outlast the Roman Empire. He ended his life instead in a room a few strides wide, in a bunker built not to project power, but to survive its collapse, beneath a garden that would be a car park within 2 generations. The empire promised to last 1,000 years lasted 12. The bunker, built to shelter its final days, barely lasted longer than the man it sheltered. Everything about the Führer bunker, its cramped rooms, its damp concrete, its unmarked ground, tells the same story from a different angle. Total power, chasing scale and permanence to the very end, finished its life underground, in the dark, in 30 small rooms, and then simply stopped.